Hello there, this is Yana Smakula for W+9 and thank you for joining me today. In this video, I'll show you how to easily add dry embossed details to your one-layer projects. I'm mostly going to be using the Holiday Bow stamp set along with coordinating dies. I love the greenery included in here and I'll be stamping those and also dry embossing to add interest and details to my projects. I've already made a number of examples using this technique in various stamp sets from W+9, and I'll show you how to make two of them in this video. One will be done on white cardstock, and another one on oatmeal cardstock for a vintage and distressed look. I'm going to start by heat embossing sentiments onto my cardstock panels. I'm using sentiments from various stamp sets today, and I'm mixing and matching them. And the first one I have here is from the Christmas Greetings stamp set. Many sentiments work for this technique, you just want to make sure that they are large enough to be the focal point of the card. This technique works for non-holiday projects also. You can use it to make Valentine's Day cards, birthday cards, and cards for other occasions as well. So I'm first stamping my sentiments in Versamark ink. This is clear, sticky ink. I've treated my paper with an anti-static powder tool to keep my embossing nice and clean, and I'm using my Misty stamp positioner today to do the stamping. I will be stamping my greenery in the same spot on both of my cardstock panels. So technically I'll be mass producing the cards, and this technique, by the way, is great for mass production. My second sentiment here comes from another stamp set, and this one is the Be Merry stamp set. I'm going to add white embossing powder and we'll heat set it with my heat tool on both of my panels. And now comes the fun part. We're going to stamp our greenery and do the dry embossing. I already know that I'd like the branches to come in from the top right corner and the bottom left corner, so this is where I'm going to do my stamping. Before I can actually stamp anything, I need to figure out my stamp placement. Because I'll be adding dry embossed details to these, I need to make sure I will have enough room for my dies on my panel. To measure if I have enough room, since the dies do have that extra metal edge around the cutting part, I'm actually going to place the dies onto the panel first. And here I'm starting with a panel where the sentiment is larger, so that my dry embossing doesn't go over the heat embossed sentiment. Once I have the dies positioned the way I want them, I'm going to tape them in place and we'll make sure they do not overlap. This is very important. If your dies overlap at this point and you do send them through the die cutting machine, you might damage your dies. So make sure they are next to each other and do not overlap at all. Next, I'm going to place the stamps that go with the dies on top of the dies. So basically at this point, the dies are only telling me where to place my stamps. They're there at this point only for that particular reason. And because these are coordinating dies, I can see through them and make sure I position my stamps properly. Once I have that done, I'm going to move my panel into my Misty. I'm going to close the Misty door and we'll pick up the stamps. Now I can remove the dies. I do not need them here at this point. We can go ahead and ink up our images and stamp them onto the panel. I'm using W+9 Last Leaf dye ink and double stamping those onto both of my panels. I'm going for the same design, just different sentiments. Once I stamp these, they do look like they are a bit too far apart. But fear not, we will add some images in the background and the end piece will look nice and full. I'm going to repeat this process and will arrange same dies onto the bottom of my panel. This time I'm using 3 dies and again arranging them the way I like. I'm taping them down with washi tape, I'm adding coordinating stamps on top, I'm moving the panel and placing it inside my Misty, I'm mounting the stamps, removing the dies, and stamping them using the same Last Leaf ink. Now, the reason we do the stamping part first and the dry embossing later is because once we do the dry embossing, we can't really add any stamping because the paper becomes uneven. It becomes embossed and debossed, so recessed in some sections, and the ink cannot reach those sections. I'm also going to do some additional stamping to add the greenery here. To make sure my additional stamped images stand out, I'm going to use a different color of ink, and I'm using Mojito. And again, I'm double stamping my images. By the way, you don't need to use a Misty for this technique. You can do this with a clear block. The procedure would be identical. the difference being that you would mount the stamps onto a clear block and will just eyeball the placement when you go to stamp them. So they will still have the same spacing in between them to make sure you'll be able to fit the dies, but you'll be just eyeballing where you stamp them onto the panels. I'm also stamping pine cones, and I'm using coconut husk ink for those. And finally, I'm adding a few little berries here and there using Gala Red dye ink. Once the stamping is done, we can go ahead and add our dry embossed detail with the help of the dies. Because we measured the space between the branches with the help of the dies, there's now enough room to place both of the dies at the same time. And you want to make sure to add the dies to the images you want to emboss at the same time. So for example, you cannot emboss one branch in that bottom cluster and then come back and emboss another next to it. Because when you do the second embossing run, the first embossing will be flattened. So you need to emboss all of these at once. So all of the branches in the bottom at once, and then all of the branches at the top at once. I'm using my Platinum 6 die cutting and embossing machine and my embossing sandwich. The embossing sandwich is different for every die cutting machine, and you'll need to check the instructions manual for your specific machine to know the proper sandwich. You will, however, need a tan embossing mat from Spellbinders to be able to emboss with your dies. So I've run my dies through the machine, and I'm going to carefully remove them and show you the embossing up close. And I love the way this turned out. It really adds a lot of texture to the otherwise simple card. I'm going to position the dies on the coordinating stamped images in the top corner of my panel and will emboss those. Now to emboss these at the top, I need to only partially cover my base panel so that I do not cover the section that has been already previously embossed. Because like I said, the pressure from the machine will flatten that embossing. After we've added the embossing to our panel, we can go ahead and add some ink blending to help the heat embossed sentiments and the dry embossed details stand out. The one on the oatmeal cardstock, the sentiment on the oatmeal cardstock, is barely visible, and the sentiment on the white cardstock is completely invisible. Of course, you could have heat embossed those in embossing powder that is more visible, so isn't white, or could have stamped those in any color of ink, but I knew that I would be adding ink blending to help the dry embossed details stand out, so this is why I went with white embossing powder. I'm using warm wool ink color and blending a little bit of this color in the center, defining the sentiment and also outlining the embossing on the branches. The part of the die that makes the cut line debossed the paper, and because that paper is pressed down so deeply, I cannot reach it with my ink blending tool. And therefore, that part of the paper maintains its original color, helping to define the embossing. It's not quite white on this oatmeal cardstock, but it is completely white on the other panel. And by the way, you can go as heavy with your ink blending or as light as you'd like. I wanted to show you the other panels I did when I tested this technique and explain some of the mistakes that I made and show you the different options that you can have. So this first panel, I did the ink blending before I did my dry embossing. Therefore, there's no white edge around the embossed branches, and the dry embossing doesn't show up right away as clearly as it does on other panels. It still looks beautiful, but it's just not the same. For my panel number 2, the branches that were supposed to be in the background were stamped using a very dark green. Therefore, they ended up looking like they are in the front of the dry embossed branches, which is still nice, but technically is incorrect. The color of ink that I used here was Apple Teeny, so it ended up being too dark. Mojito was a much better option to stamp these particular branches. Panel number 3, my dry embossing overlapped my heat embossing. In some cases, that can cause embossing powder to crack and come off the paper, so just something to keep in mind. It worked out great on this particular panel, and I'm very happy with the way it turned out. It's actually one of my favorite panels. Panel number 4, the sentiment was a little bit too small for my taste. Here's panel number 5 with ink blending done using Ocean Dive ink. And finally, panel number 6. Here I made the mistake of dry embossing the images first and stamping them later. So therefore, I couldn't stamp those additional branches in the background because it just wouldn't have looked good. I added some white gel pen details to the berries and to the branches and adhered my panels onto A2 top folding card bases, and that finished my cards. These are fun and not difficult to make. They're great to mass produce and great for mailing too because they are one layer and do not require any extra postage. Here's a closer look at these one-layer cards with dry embossed details using stamps from W+9. Thank you so much for joining me today. Be sure to check out W+9.com for more creative inspiration. I'll see you next time. Bye!